Hey class, so now that we're finished with our first project with the animal logo design, what we would like to do now is focus more on the denotative and connotative side of typography. And we want to focus on how we read typography, and there are two ways of reading typography, and that's the denotative and the connotative side. All right? The denotative is the pragmatic functionality of the typography, which asks if we can functionally read the type that we are reading. On the other hand, there's the expressive, connotative typography, and this asks, what does this make us feel, right? So we want to control both aspects of the typography, and when we're able to control both aspects of type and image, that's what makes us good designers or typographers or image makers, and that's what we want to create in our forms. To control the expressive emotive side, the way the type feels is the connotative. And then let's go into the denotative. So let's take, for example, the word museum. Here we have a very straightforward example of museum written in a sans serif on the left and a serif typeface on the right. Simple, straightforward, to the point. And then we have other uses in language that we use where we have a light weight, a medium weight, and then we have a bold weight. So those are primarily things that we use in functional typography where we need to highlight something more than something else. So we'll use a bold face. Or if we're just typing something regularly, we'll just use a medium face or a book face. If we're really trying to do something with the title, we might do like a bold face, or we could contrast and do something with a lightweight. Okay? So now we go into the connotative, the expressive side of typography. Feeling, expressing, emotive qualities of typography, this is what we want to capture in the typography itself. So we read two different ways. We read what the word says, but we're also reading the shape of the word and the forms that the letter forms are creating themselves. And this is a great example where we have the word fast on the left, but then we have it on the right where it actually has this motion quality with the italics, showing us that this is a motion type of word, where we have the thin italic and it's also capitalized. And we see more of an emotion here happening just based on our typographic treatment and our font choice. And then we take a look at connotation with the word architecture. So as you can see, there's different types of fonts here, but they can still convey a different type of architecture. So here we see something here that's bold and mechanical that functions as a type of architecture that we might see in probably an urban environment or someplace where workers are still creating a certain type of architecture. And then we also have something that might be built in the 1960s or an Art Deco period, which is what this font is. We have something here that is modern, yet has a hint of traditional with the serifs that we can see. So this could be something like, a modern farmhouse, or it could be a colonial modern house of sorts. So those are some examples of what those types of font treatments can translate to. Or we can have something that's minimal, or something that is bold but yet minimal. So those are some examples of what we can do with type, just by different types of weight and font treatments to get more of a expressive connotative feel. And then we start to get into other types of connotation and expression by breaking up the word looking like a specific block. So we're taking the word architecture and breaking it up, making it look like a block itself. Or we take the word and we just work with scale going gradually down and all the way up. So we're concaving the word architecture. So we're kind of looking at something that looks like it's going from where we see in the foreground to the background eventually. So it's creating some kind of perspective in a way, almost like an architectural drawing. So if I were to draw a line from here to here, and from here to this side, and then I have like a horizon line right here, I can kind of see this becoming a perspective drawing. And then this right here, going from smallest or furthest to near and then far. So there's some kind of play with the letter forms as well as perspective. So this is really trying to illustrate the word literally with type. Now let's take a look at some examples of denotative and connotative typography with the same kind of information. So here we're focusing on architects, different types of architects. We have Lucien Kroll, and here we have a particular poster where it's simple, straightforward, to the point. We have the name right here, and then we have the title, and then we have a pull quote right here. And as we can see, the white space kind of dictates our eye, where our eye goes here, then goes to the title, the name, goes down towards the pull quote, and then suddenly our eye goes this way to read the rest of the information along with the timeline here and the dates. So it's a very controlled motion of how the designer wants us to read this poster, very functionally, right? And now we look at the expressive version of this poster, the connotative. And as we can see, there is a lot of collaging going on, and the reason why that is a lot of different mixes of different types of what looks like wheat painted posters, different types of scratches, there's different kinds of textures going on, there's layering, and the reason why that is because this particular architect focuses on that particular kind of architecture. And his belief is you should not manufacture a city, you should let it build itself. So when we look at the architecture, we take a look at these two posters side by side, but let's take a look at the architecture. The architecture is pretty much that. It's pretty much a bunch of different layered textures on buildings that function as that collage-like treatment that we see in this particular example right here. So it's interesting how we're looking at something so expressive like this particular architectural movement, and we're able to translate that into a type-related poster expressively and functionally. And this is what we want to do. We want to make sure that we maintain control, that we read things in a certain way, and we want to make sure that we also control the expression, the emotion of that particular type of emotion that we're trying to build. Now, we also have to do this with reason. There's a reason why things look like this, is because this is why we're trying to capture, this is what we're trying to capture in our posters. Here's another example of an architect. This is Zaha Hadid, and for those of you who don't know Zaha Hadid passed away a few years ago, unfortunately. She focuses on a lot of organic type of architecture. There is no straight line in her work. So this is the denotative, functional. This is the connotative, very round, very organic, a lot of different spheres going into one another. And then we look at the actual architecture itself. This is what it looks like. So something like this makes sense in a functional, or I should say, a round and sphere-like building like this. So you want to imagine if these posters were to live in a building like this, what would they look like? They should look like something that makes sense in that space, right? But even the denotative side, the functional side, as you can see, the designer actually decided to place a font here that has a little bit of curves in it. So we at least have some kind of hint of what this architect might be focusing on, right? Let's move on to another example. Maya Lin, time, motion, and memory. This is the functional, and this is the denotative. I'm sorry, the connotative. And we take a look at these two side by side. And what does this type of architect focus on? Those are the types of forms that she likes to focus on. And you see a lot of different types of blocks. You see things falling, you see things rising up, you see different shapes kind of moving downwards. So there's a lot of kind of organic sense of movement going on. And this is what this designer wanted to capture, was this sense of movement, like trickling down, like almost like a waterfall, effect, and you see a lot of those types of moves in the actual forms that this architecture likes to create. This architect likes to create. So those are some of the things that we want to look out for. We have a studio called Archigram, and there's some of the things that they choose to focus on are quite interesting. And this is the connotative side of their poster. The denotative looks like that, so pretty bold, straightforward. We have the name of the studio, Fantastic Normatical Futurists, that's what they focus on, or what they call themselves. And then we have the body copy and timeline. So then we take a look at something that's more expressive, which shows us, okay, what is this type of architecture? Looks like it's something like what they said in their previous, so fantastic, normatical, futurist. So this is probably going to be something that's futuristic, bold, maybe somewhat modern. So it's something that we are probably going to see a lot of different forms that go into perspective and some very interesting types of buildings. So let's see what the architecture actually looks like. And in fact it does. You see buildings that are shaped that look like ships or look like something that landed in outer space. You see pipes, you see different types of forms coming out of one another. So when we think to ourselves, this actually matches this right here. So it makes sense, right? And this is what we want to focus on, that control of that expression and the emotion. And we also have to make sure that why we're creating something that looks a certain way has a reason and purpose. Okay? So another example, Carlos Scarpa. This is the denotative side. This is the connotative side. And we look at the two side by side. Now we see with this particular side right here, the connotative, we see a lot of scale and smaller scale elements happening, almost like, a big contrast between little elements and large elements. So let's take a look at the architecture. And in fact, this is what it is. We see a lot of large forms and we see a lot of smaller forms in this particular space. So we want to make sure that that is in alignment with our poster and our typography right here, right? So another example, most of you might be familiar with Frank Gehry and the Disney Concert Hall. As we know, Frank Gehry is by trait a fine artist who turned into an architect. And the type of architecture you see with Frank Gehry has a lot of collision of different forms. And this is what the typography here was supposed to be functioning as, where you see a collision of different types of forms colliding with one another. And that's exactly what Frank Gehry focuses on, is you see a lot of different types of containers in different shapes and warps just kind of colliding with one another. Yet somehow they have like a visual harmonious presence in the landscape in which they occupy. And this is what we want to create. What does an architect like Frank Gehry with forms like this happen to be attracted to when it comes to a connotative poster like this, right? But you also want to make sure, even with the denotative side, the functional side, like what is it about the functional side that we want to highlight? And we know with Frank Gehry there isn't really much of a straight line or a particular way of how he does his architecture. It kind of seems to collide with one another, similar to what's going on here. If we want a functional space right here, we want to make sure, like, okay, we at least have some structure, we have the title, we have some kind of white space that guides our eye as to where we need to read the particular name, and then the pull quote, and the timeline, and the rest of the body copy, right? For your homework, I will skip to the next video and explain what it will be.